Shakespeare's ghost and the lab rats. I see the boy Life on the booth, let's get it.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it! Is that clear? You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations, there are no peoples, there are no Russians, there are no Arabs, there are no third worlds, there is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immense, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, rims, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today.
Hey, guys. Welcome to another episode of Ron to the Hills. I'm Ron, and always with me is Don.
Hey.
And, we're going to bring you another weeks of quality entertainment here. Entertainment, maybe education. I don't really know. We got a good show on the
It's
tonight.
edumatainment.
Edumatainment.
Edumatainment
That's right.
here at Ron.
We are coining new words around here. It's been a pretty busy week, you know. We've got a lot of things going on in the news. If you want to talk about those, did you read about the OxyContin LA Times article?
Nope.
It's actually pretty big news. These LA Times reporters, they did a study on OxyContin and the marketing strategies behind it, and they found that there's a lot of legalized drug dealing there, if you will. So something to check out if you want to go hunt it down on the Googles. It's all over the Googles right now.
They'll let you know about that one.
Yeah. So, you know, legally we can sell drugs in this country if you have the right kind of company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tonight we're going to talk about a different kind of legalized drug dealing, if you will. We're going to talk some more about the banking system in this country and the Federal Reserve and how we're kind of getting just screwed from the jump. You have a term in here, Donald. It's perpetual debt slavery. Do you want to go ahead and explain that?
Perpetual debt slavery cycle.
Cycle. Okay. I missed that part of it.
Okay. Well, you have to have an understanding of how the money works before it'll make complete sense. So maybe at the end it'll make more sense to everybody out there. But
okay.
Basically you have the central bank and it loans money to the government. Then the government has to pay it back at interest.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that means that
we, the people, have to pay
never
back.
enough money to pay it all back. So it gets paid. The bankers are siphoning us through income taxes and other means, siphoning that interest money. It's a perpetual debt slavery cycle. And it just goes on and on because there's never enough money to pay the debt back because they print the money. The reason why I'm so against it is because the way that the bank works, the Federal Reserve, it's not the government.
It's not constitutional.
The Constitution says the Treasury Department is supposed to do that. So if the Treasury Department was making fake money, they wouldn't have to pay any interest on any loans. See where I'm going with this?
Correct.
So it leads up to the 1%, which, as we know, are the bankers.
Yeah, the people that
are the big boys, not the lady that works at the bank that cashes your check for you, not her.
Not even the people we've demonized on this show. We've gotten into Zolik, but we haven't gotten into the real powers that be.
Behind that, the people who are actually the money.
Yeah. And
they don't have money. They are the money.
Yeah, earlier in one of the episodes, when I was reading from the books, you know, I talked a lot about Mayer Rothschild. He's one of the 5 brothers that kind of set up this worldwide banking syndicate, if you will. They go into these different countries. He had 4 different brothers. These 4 different brothers were each sent to different cities. You had Solomon Rothschild, who was sent to Vienna. Nathan Rothschild, he was sent to London. Kalman Rothschild, he was sent to Naples. Jacob Rothschild, he was sent to Paris. They were all sent to these countries to set up this central banking
Empire.
you know? Now, here's where the flip side comes in. Because the way that they did it with the philosophy of power of just basically walking around with a bag of gold and saying, hey, you should put your money in with this money over here because I've already got this money. And it showed, oh, I'm trustworthy with money. You know, I'm going to keep it safe. I'm going to show you how to grow it. And so on and so forth.
Yeah, like they basically just implemented their father's scheme.
Yeah. And then that leads to the fractional banking systems.
Fractional reserve.
Fractional reserve.
Fractional reserve banking is the practice when a bank takes deposits and sets an interest rate.
And then they make loans at higher interest rates, correct?
Exactly. So basically what they do is for every dollar you put into the bank, because you put that dollar in there, well, now they can just loan out 3 even though they don't have it.
What's a simple concept of like a local bank might not have $300,000 to loan you to buy a house on hand, but all they have to do is write up a contract and then put the digits into a system, and now they have $300,000 to loan to you.
Exactly.
And
But the point being is they're loaning out money that doesn't exist just because they're using your $1 as collateral for $3 basically, and you know that's not a correct ratio. It's actually much higher. I can't remember what the exact number is right now, but so that's how that works.
So it sounds like you're just completely against this form of banking.
I mean, I could see some uses. My main problem with this is you've got a small group of people, families, banks, that are benefiting to this greatly. I mean, they're on the control side of the perpetual debt slavery cycle. So they are the 1%, if you will.
Yeah, they're profiteering.
They're harming us. They're harming everyone.
They're the ones that were behind the toxic mortgages back in 2008, where any Joe Schmo could go and buy a house. It didn't matter, like, as long as you had a job and a basic minimum income, they would sign you up for what's called an adjustable rate mortgage, an ARM. You know, and then, you know, the first couple of years you're paying this decent amount of mortgage, probably not that much more than rent. And then after 5 years when that adjustable rate kicks in, and then your loan, which is triggered by the national interest rates, kicks into the correct amount, and you're paying 3 times the amount you were paying before. You can't afford that on the same kind of salary you did when you were paying $900 a month for a mortgage.
Right.
And that was a pushed security in the banking systems. Bankers made crazy amount of commissions off of those kind of sales back in 2007, 2006. And who was pushing it? That 1%.
So, pedaling back a little bit to what I was saying before, the problem with the fiat currency and the fractional reserve banking is that it's been privatized into these people, the 1%. So the Constitution says the Treasury Department should do it, right? So depriving the interest payments, depriving the cycle, and effectively cutting out their biggest piece of control over everything.
You're talking about starting a war.
All these trade deals and everything that are getting put in, it's all just working towards a global central bank. So basically, it's like Rothschild said, doesn't matter who makes the laws as long as you control the money. So they control the money for the entire world. Doesn't matter. They've got a global government.
Cannot disagree with you on that. So, okay, we're diving a bit deep into the global banking systems. Let's talk a little bit about our...
Yeah, let's talk about a little bit about central banks in U.S. history.
Well, I mean, there were 2 banks. The first bank of the United States, it was 1791. So 225 years ago, Alexander Hamilton, then the Secretary of the Treasury, he accepted a compromise with some Southern lawmakers to ensure the continuation of Morris's bank project. Not too sure who Morris was.
That was the previous. It wasn't like a.
He was the
It
previous
was like an experimental
secretary.
thing. Yeah, no, it was an experimental thing. It wasn't really. It was like a project.
So Hamilton ensured sufficient support to have the national or federal capital move from its temporary northern location to a more southern location located on the Potomac. As a result, the first bank of the U.S. from 1791 to 1811 was chartered by Congress within the year and signed by George Washington soon after. It was modeled after the Bank of England, but differed in many ways from today's central banks. For example, it was partly owned by foreigners who shared in its profits.
Well, that's not really different from today's central banks.
Maybe not.
It's not at all. Anyway, the main point, I think, is that at that point, they were only responsible for 20% of the currency supply. So there was only 20% of United States currency. The rest of it was just
State
banknotes
banks.
and different things like that. It's notable that Thomas Jefferson opposed it, obviously, since he's TJ Maxx.
TJ Maxx. I like
TJ
that
Maxx,
nickname.
he's my favorite one. I mean, they all suck in different ways, but he's probably my favorite one.
And they had their downsides, but I
Yeah.
believe everybody is. So he saw it as an engine for speculation, corruption, and financial manipulation. Not too far off of what we have today. You know?
So the charter was expired, and it wasn't renewed.
Yep. Boom. Next thing you know, War of 1812 happens, and
Bam.
we can't really finance it.
Nope. So
Because-
what do?
We create a second Bank of the United States. After 5 years, the federal government rechartered its successor, the second bank. So this one went from 1816 to 1836. James Madison signed the charter with the intention of stopping runaway inflation that had plagued the country. It's basically a copy of the first bank with branches across the country. Andrew Jackson, who became president in 1828, denounced the bank as an engine of corruption.
There you go. I mean, they knew what it was. It's the same game they play today.
Wasn't he shot?
Andrew, yeah, he was shot at. They didn't kill him. I think it was like 2 or 3 times, maybe too.
Yeah.
I'm not. You can't quote me on that. I'm not exactly sure, but it was more than once. Yeah, and it's interesting to note too that they're taking his face off of the 20.
Wait.
You don't remember hearing about that? They're making a big controversy trying to make it
No,
like
no, I do.
they're
I do.
taking him off and putting a chick on. Like that's supposed to be some kind of big deal.
It's
or
Harriet
something.
Tubman that they're putting on there.
Whatever. I don't even know what's going on exactly with it because it's a waste of time. But the thing to note about that to me is that they're taking him off of it.
Yep.
So who's on the 10? Ben Franklin?
Dude, I don't know.
No, he's on the
100.
100. He's on the 100.
I'm broke, son. I don't know.
100.
He's on the 100.
Who's on the who? Oh, Alexander Hamilton,
Hamilton.
and he was a proponent of central banking
Man,
system.
he
So
signed in the
instead of-
first one.
Oh yeah, so they got a choice to pick between Andrew Jackson or Hamilton to go. Who? Yeah. Bye, Andrew.
I mean, that's just crazy. So he destroyed the bank in the 30s. And it was
Yeah.
a major political issue. I mean, as it would always be. Could you imagine the kind of propaganda that was given back then?
Oh man.
And the craziest part about it is this, as of right now, is almost still 200 years ago. So as a country, we've been fighting against this kind of stuff for fucking years.
And it comes and goes. So, I mean, because after that,
Well, I mean, honestly, dude, the reason that I'm such a big Bernie guy is he's the only candidate who's legitimately talking about going after the banks. Most importantly, the Federal Reserve, as you and I agree upon. Give a damn his socialist propaganda bullshit. Anyways, so back to Andrew Jackson and opposing the banks.
Yeah, well, so they tried to cap him a couple times. That didn't work. He ended up getting them stomped out. And,
Well, he couldn't get them dissolved, but he definitely refused to renew the charter.
right.
So either way, he did eliminate them. Once again, though, when the bank was ended, you saw a period of runaway inflation, which was purportedly engineered by the bankers. Jackson attempted to counteract this by federal executive order requiring all federal land payments to be made in gold and silver. This produced the Panic of
Right.
1837.
So runaway inflation is caused by what? Fractional reserve banking, because this person puts this amount of gold in the bank and then they turn around and loan out paper notes. Instead of loaning out one gold bar, they loan out 3 gold bars. So that's what creates the inflation.
Wait, but no, the ending of the banks caused, after the banks ended, the inflation started.
Right after the central bank ended.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had all of these different state banks, instead of the United States picking up its responsibility, still then we even didn't pick up our responsibility, to create its own independent central bank and have its own standards, FDIC, everything completely, under the control of,
Everybody's
of the
getting paid
Treasury
their money.
Department. You've got all these different little banks just participating in the fractional reserve banking system and creating more and more money, loaning more and more money when it's not really there, and it's creating inflation. So instead of having the central bank creating one currency, you've got all these different little banknotes, which are becoming not backed by less and less and less because of fractional reserve banking.
It's actually a pretty brilliant way to explain the next 24 years of what goes on. So in 1837, there's the Panic. It's a depression. I mean, it's a major recession. It lasts till the mid-40s. In this time period, it's known as the free banking era, from 1837 to about 1862, coincidentally enough, coinciding with the start of the Civil War. What you're talking about during the free banking system was the Wildcat system, where each state printed their own amount of money just to kind of keep up, because you couldn't have enough gold to keep businesses expanding. For a business to expand further west, because in that time period also we were dealing with the railroad system.
Without deflating prices.
Well, and there's logistically just not enough gold and silver
Right.
to go around. So you
Right.
have to make
so
notes
you would
from
have
somewhere.
Right. But then they become not backed by anything real and substantial because of fractional reserve banking when it gets extended out. So that's what dilutes its value even further. I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't always have to be backed by gold or silver too. They can figure out a way. And even if the big brains figure out that is the way to go, it needs to be taken out of the hands of the 1%, put back into public control.
Can't say it any better myself. I cannot disagree with you on that statement right there. Well, you got me speechless here, bro.
Well,
We're getting offhand.
Civil War, I think, is where we left off.
We were talking a little bit more about that free banking.
Oh,
period.
right.
Because when people, this is the thing that gets me about capitalism. At its core, they're always talking about the free market. And legitimately, in that time period right there, you had the free market. You had no central overbearer of the market to manipulate prices. What you did have there was rampant speculation. Basically, like, what you could do is you could go from Virginia, buy a bunch of Virginia greenbacks, take them up to New York where they're worth probably $1.50, and then sell them there. I'm not saying those two states specifically, but what I'm saying is like the kind of currency speculation that you would have found in those days would rival today's time period. And you can look at the foreign exchange market and look at the same thing that, say, what China's doing with the yuan. Right now, China is inflating their currency, and they're admitting that they're doing this. As our biggest debt holder, however, there is nothing that we can do to stop them. A trade war is not possible because of the deficit that we're in. But I'm getting way offhand. So the kind of corruption and rampant speculation that Thomas Jefferson, T.J. Maxx was worried about is happening in this free banking era. Capitalism is a dangerous thing when you let it go unregulated. It's the same way with socialism and communism. If you do not want these isms to ever get
Speaking of, I got
in full control, extreme control.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off early.
No, you're good.
I got this pretty good Thomas Jefferson quote.
What's that?
The central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I am an enemy to all banks discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. If American people allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
The scariest part about that right now is that you can argue that the past 2 generations of people born into this country today live in that reality. A good majority of Americans.
Yep.
And you can say, strap on your work boots and get your American ethic out, but it doesn't quite work like that because the system that we live in is so very much rigged against us.
Very much stacked against us.
And we can bust ass all we want to, but we're still going to be capped by that system right there that we're talking about.
Like I said, to me, the best thing we can do, the biggest blow that we can actually give to the 1%, realistically, would be to gain control of the banking system back into the public sector.
And funny enough, the next part of what we're going to talk about, I don't actually want to get into it this side of the break because I feel like the Civil War is a very important talking point as to where we're going. Being as though, let's bring it back up to today's speed. So we're in this period where it's 103 years since this monster has conglomerated. Can we ever go back to a free banking era?
No, see,
Like, that's not possible in today's global market.
What as saturated as everything is, there's no way for us to just jump right off of. I mean, I guess Ron Paul had an idea of creating an opposing currency by the Treasury Department to oppose the Federal Reserve, but I think it just needs to be shut down.
Well, I mean, you can look at Bitcoins, and you can look at, there's this thing called dog coins. There's like multiple different kind of coins that have markets based around them. They're based around the same kind of algorithm where for you to have an involvement in Bitcoin, you've got to be involved in their blockchain, which is their form of accounting for
You
it.
have to put in a certain amount of effort into mining that Bitcoin.
Exactly. So
It's the same principle.
Your faith in the product, the same way we have faith that the dollar is going to buy us $1 worth of goods when we go and spend that dollar, is what is just as important there. And that's what a fiat currency is. It's what we have right now. Simple faith. And that's why when after 9/11 happened, for example, the number one thing that Bush pushed and his administration pushed was that we continued to spend. We had to keep spending money. We had to keep the economy going.
Got to keep pushing that perpetual debt slavery cycle.
Well, I mean, it's this rampant consumerism that is just driving the culture. It's driven the culture off the edge of the cliff. And now it's like threatening to drive our actual country off the edge of the cliff. And if we allow our next two big options as president, that's probably what's going to end up happening. I hate Ted Cruz with all of my heart, but the simple measure of what he was trying to do of shutting the government down to the necessary parts, it kind of needs to happen at some point.
I believe it does too, but I also believe that was all just a part of a show.
It was, and that's what we hate about him, is because he wasn't real when he did that. He did it as part of a ploy to become.
Because it didn't really have the effect it was intended on having or anything at all either. It was a bunch of fucking bullshit.
And everybody's got Google now. If you're married to a high up exec at one of the major financial firms in this country, who everybody in the country knows is running this country, and you used to be a lawyer for the president who stole an election and then just started us on this crash course we're on.
Not to mention the wife wrote the white paper towards North American community, which we know is part of NAFTA as a trade agreement to set up more regional currencies like the euro.
Yeah, when you have that kind of luggage with you and you go and you try to pull a political ploy like this, I want to back you. I want to fucking back you. I want to say yes, down with this shit, but we can't buy into you
because we know you're full of shit. Your actions don't represent your words. This is why the main reason why I like Ron Paul is because I didn't agree with him 100% on everything, but he was there on the key points with the Fed and most everything else. And, you know, he was legit. You can go back years and years and years. Always said the same thing, always voted the same way. That's why they hated him.
Well, that's one of the reasons I give Bernie credit for, man. His voting record is pretty spectacular when it comes to being on the right side of history, in my opinion, you know.
Nah, I can't get behind him ideologically, man.
Yeah, no, I completely understand it, man. The isms are going to catch everybody.
Yeah, well,
we got some music coming up, man.
When it's applied to the real world there, it actually becomes a bigger problem. No, we got music. We always got music. This is a radio station, after all.
Oh, man.
All right, so we want to hear from you guys. If you got something to say, Ronnie, let's give out that number, hot guy.
Oh, man, that phone number is 757-848-5920.
848-5920.
757-Titley20, if you will. Yeah.
See you on the other side.
Yeah, right, man. I love that song.
Yeah, what was that, Justin?
Justin, hey, producer guy.
Thoughts by Bottom Feeder.
Right.
Oh, Bottom Feedy.
Bottom Feeder, huh?
My favorite.
Man, I love those guys.
My favoritist.
So we're going to go ahead and open up the phones for you guys. Got something to add to the conversation we're having about the banks in this country. You can give us a call, 757-848-5920.
Also, do want to apologize. Last week before the show, I heavy-handed my computer screen and broke it.
Yeah, you guys might notice we don't really have such good production
today.
today.
We don't have any sound bites or custom spots.
Oh, man.
We got the Bottom Feeder, though.
Our phone calls are going to suffer tonight. We're not going to have the clip for you guys. Apologize for that.
Ronnie can't answer the sample tonight.
I can't answer it, man. I'm upset about this.
Hey. How's it hanging, S.A.? What? All right,
man. So before the break, we left off with the banking system right before the Civil War. You know, we got through the free banking period, and anybody who ever says anything about there never being a free market in this country, please go study that time period. There was a time period of capitalism ran rampant in this country, and it didn't quite work.
Yeah, well, they didn't also have the national currency under a public central bank either.
Well, they didn't have a good infrastructure set up. None of these isms ever have a good infrastructure set up. Okay? So let's go to the Civil War, man. 1861, you know. You're a Virginian, I'm a Virginian. You're probably a little bit more northern than I am. I'm a southern boy, you know. They're splitting us up ideologically. We used to be friends, and now we can't stand each other, man. Why? Is it because I own slaves and you don't? Because if you lived up north, you owned slaves too. That really wasn't the actual issue of the Civil War. It was an issue of the Civil War, but it wasn't the main one. I'd make the argument that our banking system was the main issue of the Civil War.
I wish I had some samples right now, man.
Oh, man. What would you sample right there?
What?
Am I going a little too far there?
You're racist.
God! It's not even a racism thing, man.
I know. I'm just teasing you, Ronnie.
I can't not take you seriously on air. That's the whole point of this show. It's the only serious show on this radio station. The only one. I'm sorry, Powers that be.
Look,
Drink
man.
Gatorade. You love it.
Look, man. There's plenty of seriousness about comedy shows and entertainment pieces.
I'm sorry, Tim. Please call in 848-5920. I apologize if I ever offended you.
We heard you got something you want to talk about. You can call us.
Call us up,
we'll
man.
Talk about it with you.
We'll talk about the Civil War banking structure.
So back to that.
Bam. 1963.
What?
The United States federal government passes the National Bank Act.
How'd you get from
Because, man, that's
Civil War
where
to
the script went.
1963?
1863. Jesus Christ, man. I can't even get my days right.
Oh, my
1863.
God. All right, there you go. That's all right. That's why I was just wondering. I thought we were jumping ahead, maybe.
Probably.
63, wasn't it?
Nothing important happens from 1863 to 1963. The next thing important that happens is the Beatles come to America.
You're right.
All right. 1863, the National Bank Act is passed. It's designed to create a national banking system, float federal war loans, and establish a national currency. Congress passed the act to help resolve the financial crisis that emerged during the early days of the Civil War. The fight with the South was expensive, and there wasn't a tax plan for it. So, back it up to 1861. Banks suspend specie payments. Specie?
Pretty sure.
Probably it is specie. I mean, yeah. So these are payments in gold or silver coins for paper currency called notes or bills. Basically, it's the act of you want what your dollar's worth in gold. You take it to the bank. They give you however much gold it's worth. Banks stopped doing that shit. So people can't convert their banknotes into coins. Government responds by passing the Legal Tender Act, issuing $150 million in national notes called greenbacks. You might have heard of these notes. They're kind of expensive on eBay. I was looking some up the other day.
Ain't worth nothing but a greenback, something like that.
Yep. However, these banknotes accounted for most of the currency in circulation. So, no, not the greenbacks. The paper bills issued by state banks were most of the currency in circulation.
Right, the promissory debt bills that they made up out of nowhere that caused all the inflation.
So, in order to bring financial stability to the nation and fund the war effort, the National Bank Act of '63 was introduced in Senate. Republicans, they loved it, and they went ahead and promoted it. Bill was approved by Senate. The House passed it in February. National banks that were organized under this act were required to purchase government bonds as a condition of a startup. Basically, you have to buy into the government.
Right.
You know, it's a pretty smart way to do things, right?
If you're going to do it that way, I guess.
Well, the full faith and credit of the United States is a very powerful phrase and a very powerful tool that has kind of been shaken up throughout the past 50-some-odd years, correct?
Right.
All right. So as soon as the bonds were deposited with the federal government, the bank could issue its own notes up to 90% of the market value of the bonds on deposit. Fractional reserve banking.
Boom. 90%.
No. So they had to have 90% of what they printed in reserve.
They limited it down to 10% inflation.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's not a bad number because you do need a bit of leeway there so that a bank doesn't have to just some businessman comes in there and say, hey, I want to build this giant railroad and then clean the bank out. You can't have that. So the National Banking Act, it approved, but it didn't solve the nation's financial problems. Some of those banks from the states, they'd been issuing notes. They were converted to national banks by additional legislation. You know, that amended the original Bank Act and was passed in '64. Other state banks were driven out of business or ceased to issue notes after the 1865 passage of a 10% federal tax on notes they issued, which pretty much made it unprofitable for them to make money. You know, this legislation created $300 million in national currency in the form of notes issued by the national banks. But because most of this money was distributed in the East, the money supply in other parts of the country remained precarious. The West, they demanded more money. You were trying to expand the country and the nation into the West.
Right.
They needed money there.
Building the rail lines, all that stuff.
Exactly. This issue would dominate American politics in the years after the Civil War. Nevertheless, the nation's banking system stayed largely the same despite the Panic of 1873 until the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. The Panic of 1873 is actually the first Great Depression that this country went through. There were actually two of them. Most people don't know about the Panic in 1873. You know, I do know that history doesn't teach much from, at least history when I went to high school 15 years ago, didn't teach much from the Civil War until the Industrial Revolution. That, 30-year time period is filled with carpetbaggers in the South and Reconstruction. And basically how the South had no money, they had to sign away land and rights to the northern banks to rebuild their own towns that had been destroyed in the Civil War. What was that phrase you used earlier? Perpetual debt slavery cycle?
Something like that.
Man, sounds like a pretty good way to start that cycle would be to burn a town down and then sell them the loans.
Yep.
Jesus Christ, man. So the Panic of 1873, Donald, you want to start talking about this? Or
No, you got.
I'll keep droning.
Do it. You got it.
So the Panic of 1873 was a financial crisis that triggered a depression in Europe and North America that lasted from 73 until 79 and even longer in other countries. In Britain, it started 2 decades known as the Long Depression that weakened the country's economic leadership. The panic was also known as the Great Depression until the events in the 1930s set a new precedent. The Panic of 73 and the subsequent depression had several underlying causes, of which historians debate the relative importance. American post-Civil War inflation, rampant speculative investments, overwhelmingly in railroads, a large trade deficit, ripples from economic dislocation in Europe, blah, blah, blah. There were 2 giant fires, one in Chicago and one in Boston in 1871 and 1872, respectively. So all of these different factors put a massive strain on bank reserves, which plummeted in New York City in 1873 from 50 million to 17 million. So basically, if you go back to your 90% ratio there, the national bank in this country lost $33 million, just flat out. Of which, let's see, I guess it wouldn't have been so bad because only, $3.3 million needs to be accounted for really there. Because you can take the loss of the $33 million, but the 10% of the inflation that just goes into the national debt, correct? If my knowledge of fractional reserve banking is working correctly. Dear God, we're going too deep, man. I'm getting lost here.
Well, it may be a little different at this time.
Yeah, okay. So you had some symptoms of this crisis. There were financial failures in Austria-Hungary capital Vienna, which spread to most of Europe and North America. So after the Civil War, there was a boom in railroad construction. For example, the largest employer outside of agriculture was the railroad industry. This involved a lot of money and a lot of risk.
Side note on the railroad industry, it's actually why there was a lot of Asians that settled in California, because they went and got them, the coolies.
Cheap labor,
and they basically built the railroads out to California and then just stayed. And it also, man, that's why we got shrimp too, because it used to be a junk fish, but then they saw the Chinese people making all that money on it and sending it home. Then they started cutting them out of it. Interesting little side note there.
Man, there's a lot of different side notes in American history that are just not taught in schools at all. I mean, it took a lot of time and effort for us to dig this kind of information up, and a lot of it's mind-blowing, man. We've been under a lot of assumptions in life that a lot of this stuff is new, but it's not really. Just the technology is new.
A lot of people still don't realize that the money doesn't come from the government, that it's private banks that create it.
A lot of people don't know that the Federal Reserve is not a part of the federal government.
That's what I mean.
God, the Federal Reserve
they even
is such
name
a
it
monster.
that way to trick you into thinking that. It's like they were thinking 100 years down the road. You know what I mean?
So we're not even going to get to the Federal Reserve today. That's going to be an entire episode of itself. I got some books for that one.
Got some books for you guys. You like to read, right?
So we got to get back into this history lesson, though, man, because you got to know your history. So like you were saying with the different populations that were settled there, it's because at that time there would be people in the different business capitals. There's a reason that New York and Boston are business capitals of the world right now. It's because the old money made their money from speculating on railroads and speculating on, say, the gold rush and speculating on what was out west and can we develop an awesome civilization out west. So a lot of this old money is tied into the railroads. Also in 1873, you had a pretty important thing happen. The Coinage Act is passed. And I know it sounds like I'm jumping, but this involves silver. A lot of what the minerals they were looking for out west were gold and silver. So in 1873, the German Empire decides to not mint silver coins anymore. You know, they said, we're not making our coins out of silver. This caused a drop in demand and downward pressure on the value of silver, which had this huge knock-on effect in the United States. Now all of a sudden people don't want the silver that they're sending back, so the silver isn't as important as the gold is. This caused the United States federal government to drop the silver standard, because gold also used to be, or our dollar used to also be backed by gold and silver. There's a silver standard. We dropped that. Our coins aren't made from silver anymore. and silver doesn't become as important as gold, thereby pretty much reducing its value in half. I mean, even to this day, if you look at the
Right.
price of gold
It's way
compared to silver.
It's way more than half.
Oh, yeah. It's because one empire decided that it wasn't as important of a metal as another, you know? So this hurt the mining industries. This hurt the railroad industries, which ended up hurting the speculators, which ended up bringing an effect on the economy because the speculators were the bankers, because you didn't have the kind of regulations on the bankers as you did even until Glass-Steagall was repealed.
Right. Well, Glass-Steagall came later.
Yeah. Glass-Steagall's like way on down the road after the Federal Reserve. So the coinage law also hurt the domestic money supply, which raised interest rates, which also hurt the farmers and anybody else who carried a heavy debt load. Can you think of any kind of industry so carry a heavy debt load? I'm kind of blanking here because to me it's like the farmer would be the epitome of that.
Right.
Because he's so invested in what he's doing that if he does not have a good crop, he's just bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I mean, there was a lot of coal mining going on then too, right?
Yeah. I guess they'd have been majorly affected. You know, your boss comes in and we're gold miners now, and he says, "Hey, you guys, I don't want any more fucking silver. You bring that crap to me, you're fired."
No, I said coal mining.
Oh, I thought you said, you know,
But
gold
mining,
miners,
that
silver
too.
miners.
That too. Same thing, mining in general. Same thing, I guess.
So this outcry, it raised several questions about how long this new policy would last. This perception of instability in the United States monetary policy caused investors to shy away from long-term obligations, particularly long-term bonds, which basically says, is the government going to keep its word in 50 years?
Right.
They're usually some of the safest. They're the backbone of most people's investment portfolios. So then that problem is also compounded by the railroad boom, which is in its later stages. In September of 1873, the U.S. economy entered a crisis. This followed a period of overexpansion that arose from the Northern Railroad boom, came at a series of economic setbacks. The Black Friday Panic of '69, Chicago Fire of 1871, equine influenza, demonetization of silver, and then in also 1873, the J. Cook Company failed. We don't know the name J. Cook Company because it was a major component back in the 1800s. They would be like Lehman Brothers, for example. In 100 years, do you think anybody's actually going to know the name Lehman Brothers?
Maybe.
I doubt it. Well,
If they get their way.
people like you and me who's going to go back and say, the system sucks and we need to research how we can destroy this.
How did it start?
Oh, man. They're going to look back and they're going to say, J. Cook and Company. They found themselves unable to market several $1 million in Northern Pacific Railway bonds. Cook's firm, like many others, had invested heavily in the railroads.
Wait a minute, how much was that?
Several million.
Oh, I thought you said 700 million.
No.
It's like, wow, that's a lot for back then.
Yeah, there wasn't that much money in supply at that point.
Yeah.
So banks were anxious for more capital. President Grant at the time contracted the money supply, as that's a power of the president that most people don't know, I guess.
No.
No? It's telling me right here that President Grant had this power to do this.
Maybe he did it through his executive order or something.
Maybe. But I mean, him contracting the money supply raised interest rates. So that made matters worse for people in debt. So now you're getting F two ways.
Mm-hmm.
The minerals that you use for your business, they're not worth anything and taxes are going up. So these businesses that are expanding, the money they needed to finance that growth was becoming scarcer. Cook and other entrepreneurs had planned to build a second transcontinental railroad called the Northern Pacific Railway. Cook's firm provided the financing and ground was broken. Just as Cook was about to swing a $300 million government loan, reports circulated that his firm's credit had become worthless. 2 months later, firm declares bankruptcy. This failure set off a chain reaction of bank failures and temporarily closed the New York stock market. Factories began to lay off workers as the United States slipped into depression. The effects of the panic were quickly felt in New York and more slowly in Chicago, Virginia, Nevada, and San Francisco.
Now, this was in 18. When was this?
1873.
1873. So we're not talking about 1930s.
No. But we are talking about the stock exchange closing for 10 days in September. And then in November, about 55 of the nation's railroads had failed. A month later, another 60 went bankrupt. Construction of new rail lines plummeted, and unemployment peaked at, get this, 8.25%. What's today's unemployment rate? It's higher than that, right? I guess.
I don't know. It depends on how you calculate it.
In 1879, though, we get a relief. We get a relief in the form of immigration. This is when we had the waves of people coming over from Europe, and it's just waves of people that come in, and they kind of lift us up. Do you know how they lift us up? Cheap labor.
Cheap labor.
System
In the
starts
railroad,
again.
in the railroad's case, it was the coolies, the opium dens from China. They'd pick them up.
Yep. And from there, it's just this.
I mean, there
cycle.
was others too. I mean, don't get me wrong. It wasn't just Asians that built the railroads. There was plenty of other immigrants and other non-Europeans, and also Europeans. Then I think that then they Germans or Irish was it?
Which ones? Irish need not apply.
Forget it. It's not important.
I mean, they didn't trust the gingers when they came over. But so pretty much that's all I've got until the Federal Reserve Act. So the country is in this system where you have a handful of major railroad companies.
Well, you got the Panic of 1907.
You want to talk about that one a little bit?
The Panic of 1907. Let's see if I can remember about this.
We got a few minutes to go.
It basically it was a run on the banks, and it was the disaster that started the push towards the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
So they say, people have speculated that it was actually calculated by it was the Morgan banking empire trying to because of the speculation and everything, putting out fake info, a la Rothschild, and causing a run on the competing banks.
Okay, so they're saying that this panic was triggered by a failed attempt in October to corner the market on stock of the United Copper Company. So it's another trying to cornering of one resource.
But it led to a run on the banks.
Yeah. So when this bid failed, banks that had lent money to the cornering scheme suffered runs that later spread to affiliated banks and trusts, leading to a week later to the downfall of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, New York's third largest trust. The collapse spread fear throughout the city's trust as regional banks withdrew reserves from New York City banks.
Taking out the competition.
Well, and these other banks, like, if I'm a part of a member board with another bank and my bank's doing great and their bank is failing because their speculators, their trading department is running amok, I want nothing to do with that. You're not taking more money to fuel your terrible habits over there, buddy. Carry your ass up the street. And so that panic, it's funny because the internet's actually defending this guy here. Oh, sounds like we got a phone call, man.
Well, you're a little late. We got time for maybe a short one.
We got 5 minutes here. Just to say, that panic would have been worse if it weren't for J.P. Morgan, who went into his own pockets to float money to some of the necessary banks at that time. Leave it to Wikipedia. Leave it to Wikipedia. Caller, you there?
Hey guys,
Hey, what's up, buddy?
I wanted to share a little piece of information I picked up.
All right, we'll make it quick, Phantom Spy. We're right at the end of the hour.
Yeah, well, that's your fault for taking so long to get through the whole show.
You could have called at any
Listen.
point.
No, because I just remembered that you guys are doing a fucking show. So
You always have an open line, Bill. There, buddy.
Go ahead.
yeah. So I got this coworker, and this guy, he comes from, pretty old money. He's pretty connected. His family's pretty connected, and I haven't worked with this guy in a long time. This is years ago since I've even talked to him, but he has some kind of connection through one of his uncles or something like that, kind of an in at one of the Federal Reserve banks. I think it's out in Kentucky, I want to say. All right. Now, this guy told me that his uncle got trashed at one of these family events, and started talking. He was pinging him on what you guys are talking about here, the whole banking control, currency control. And apparently he let slip something about a copper coin, some kind of a copper coin on the horizon.
Like more valuable than the penny?
Like as a
Like
a regional currency, or
something like a device, like a embedded chip coin.
an embedded chip coin.
Like
Like
a
you're saying,
smart
like
coin.
a smart
Smart
coin.
coin.
Yeah, I'd heard something too in the past about barcoded money. Barcoded
Not
paper.
barcoded. I'm talking about like
No,
RFID.
I know you mean like an actual chip, but I'm just saying I had heard something that was similar about barcoded money. It's the whole cashless society thing. They want to track every individual transaction.
Right.
We're going to need to get an in with this guy.
All right, well, thank you for your call there, Phantom Spy, but we got a jet.
Yep.
See you next time. Ron in the Hills.